My name is Douglas Mercer. I'm 47 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and a man trying to make peace with himself. Life hasn't been kind to me lately. I lost my wife 6 months ago, and my son, well, he's gone too. I don't want to talk about how. It hurts too much. All I know is that I promised him I'd take his ashes to Pinewood Lake, the place we used to camp together when he was little. Maybe scattering them there will help me heal, or at least quiet the nightmares. I arrived at Pinewood Lake on a chilly October afternoon in my old Winnebago Brave. The drive up the dirt road was rough, but the view was worth it. The lake was surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed ancient, like they'd been watching over this place for centuries. The air smelled of earth and pine needles, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The campground was nearly empty. There was an elderly couple parked a few spots away in a shiny RV. They introduced themselves as the Johnsons and a park ranger named Marcus Wheeler who stopped by to check permits. He seemed nice enough, but something about his eyes made me uneasy. They were sharp, like he noticed things most people wouldn't. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, and when I looked at the trees nearby, I noticed strange claw marks on their bark. They were deep and jagged, like something big had scraped against them. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my RV, I heard something outside. At first, it sounded like the wind rustling through the trees, but then it became clearer. A voice calling my name, Douglas. It was soft and familiar, almost like my wife's voice. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself. Grief does strange things to people, doesn't it? But still, hearing her voice out here in the middle of nowhere, it didn't feel right. The next morning, as I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I noticed deer tracks circling my RV. They weren't normal tracks. They were perfect circles around my campsite, almost like someone had drawn them there deliberately. When I mentioned it to the Johnsons later that day, they exchanged uneasy glances. We heard strange noises last night, too, Mrs. Johnson said quietly, like whispers coming from the woods. Her husband nodded but didn't say anything else. I tried to brush it off as nothing, just animals, or maybe even my imagination. But deep down, something about this place felt wrong. By the third day, I was starting to feel uneasy. The claw marks on the trees, the strange deer tracks, and the whispers in the night. It was all adding up to something I couldn't explain, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. I had a promise to keep, and I wasn't going to let my nerves get in the way. That morning, I decided to go for a hike around the lake. The air was colder than it should have been for October, and frost sparkled on the ground even though the forecast had said it would be mild. As I walked along the trail, I met a man named Frank Redmond. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with a rugged look that told me he'd spent most of his life outdoors. Not many folks come up here this time of year, Frank said as he adjusted his hunting rifle. Hungry season starting. Hungry season? I asked, confused. Frank gave me a serious look. People go missing in these woods when it gets cold. Locals have stories about it, legends passed down from the tribes that used to live here. I didn't want to believe him, but something about his tone made me listen closely. They call it Wendigo, he continued. A spirit of famine and winter. It sits said to feed on people, sits to spare, and their flesh. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as just another campfire story. But Frank didn't laugh. He just looked at me like he knew something I didn't. When I got back to my RV later that afternoon, my stomach dropped. Sitting on the steps was my son's teddy bear, the one I'd placed inside the urn with his ashes before leaving home. It was impossible for it to be there. No one else knew about it. I picked up the bear slowly, my hands trembling. It smelled faintly of pine and dirt, like it had been sitting in the woods for years. My mind raced with questions. Had someone broken into my RV? Was this some kind of cruel joke? That night, things got worse. The Johnsons disappeared without a trace. Their RV door was wide open when I checked on them in the morning, and half-eaten plates of food were still sitting on their table like they'd been interrupted during dinner. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away from their campsite, just emptiness. I tried calling Ranger Wheeler on my CB radio, but all I got was static mixed with faint whispers that sounded like voices. One of them sounded like my son saying, "Come play with me." My hands shook as I turned off the radio. Later that day, while walking through the woods near my campsite, I noticed strange symbols carved into several trees. The same claw marks, but arranged in patterns this time. They looked deliberate, almost like warnings or wards against something. Frank showed up again as I studied one of the carvings. "Those are protective symbols," he said grimly. "They don't always work." "What do you mean?" I asked. Frank hesitated before answering. "It means whatever seps out here is stronger than most folks realize." The air grew colder as we talked, and frost began forming on the ground again, even though there wasn't a cloud in sight. Frank looked around nervously before heading back toward his own campsite. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard my son's voice again, clearer this time. "Dad, come play." It came from deep within the forest, pulling at something inside me that wanted so badly to believe he was still alive. But I knew better. By the 7th day, everything had changed. The weather turned against me, and a sudden blizzard hit the area. I didn't even know it was coming. The forecast had said nothing about snow. The dirt road leading out of the campground was completely buried under ice and snow, making it impossible to leave. The cold wasn't normal. It felt sharp, like it was cutting through my skin no matter how many layers I wore. Frost covered my RV windows, and even inside with the heater running, I couldn't shake the chill. That evening, as I tried to distract myself by reading an old book, my CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then I started hearing voices, distorted and broken, like they were coming from far away. "Douglas," a voice whispered. It sounded like my wife. "Dad." Another voice called out softly, "My son." I stared at the radio, frozen in place. They sounded so real, so close. But I knew it couldn't be them. My hands trembled as I reached out to turn the radio off. But before I could, the voices shifted into something darker, low growls and whispers that made my skin crawl. I slammed the switch off and sat there in silence for what felt like hours. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the road conditions again. That's when I saw them. Deer carcasses scattered around the edge of the campsite. They weren't just lying there. They were arranged in strange patterns, their bodies twisted unnaturally. Their eyes were wide open, frozen in fear. Frank showed up around noon, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he gripped his rifle tightly. "It sets awake," he said in a hoarse whisper. "What seps is awake?" I asked. "The Wendigo," Frank replied. "Its sep's been sleeping for decades, but something woke it early this year." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that this was just some wild animal or maybe a prank. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was out here wasn't normal. Frank helped me carve protective symbols into the sides of my RV that afternoon. He said they might keep the creature away for a while, but he didn't sound confident. That night, as we sat inside my RV trying to come up with a plan to escape, something happened that made my blood run cold. There was a loud thud against the side of the RV, so loud it shook the entire vehicle. Frank grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to stay quiet. We listened as heavy footsteps circled around us, slow and deliberate. Then came the voice again, my son Sep's voice. "Dad, let me in." Frank's eyes widened as he looked at me. "Don't open that door," he whispered. I nodded and stayed frozen in place as the footsteps grew louder and closer. Suddenly, everything went silent. The next morning, Frank was gone. I found his rifle lying outside on the ground near my RV steps, but it wasn't normal anymore. The barrel had been bent into an impossible shape, like someone had twisted it with their bare hands. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Frank was gone. His rifle twisted like it was made of rubber, and I was completely alone now. The snow outside had piled up so high that even if I wanted to leave, I couldn't. The road was gone, buried under ice and snow, and the forest felt more alive than ever, like it was watching me. Around noon, I decided to search for Frank. Maybe he'd wandered off and gotten lost in the storm. I couldn't just sit in my RV and do nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the woods, following the trail of his footprints. That's when I found him, or what was left of him. Frank's body was hidden behind a cluster of trees, slumped against the trunk like he'd been dropped there. His chest cavity was empty, completely hollowed out, and his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. I stumbled back, my stomach turning as I tried not to throw up. I didn't know what to do. Should I go back to the RV? Try to call for help? But who could help me out here? The storm had cut off all communication, and even if someone did come, what could they do against whatever this thing was? As I turned to head back to camp, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. My heart raced as I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. It was Ranger Wheeler, or at least it looked like him. "Douglas," he said in a calm voice, "you need to come with me. My truck's still working. We can get out of here." For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe this nightmare was finally over, but then I noticed something wrong. His movements weren't natural. His arms hung stiff at his sides as he walked, and his head tilted slightly too far to one side, like it wasn't attached properly. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. "How's your son?" Wheeler asked casually. I froze. He couldn't have known about my son. I hadn't mentioned him to anyone here. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Wheeler smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched across his face like it didn't belong there. "I've been waiting for you." I turned and ran as fast as I could back to my RV, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. My hands shook as I grabbed Frank's protective symbols and started carving them into the inside walls of the RV. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't Wheeler anymore. That night, the whispers came back louder than ever. "Douglas, let me in. Dad, come play." The voices surrounded the RV. Coming from every direction, shadows moved outside the windows, tall and thin with antlers that glinted in the moonlight. My son's ashes began to glow faintly in their urn on the table, warming the air around them even as frost covered everything else. That's when I saw it, the Wendigo. It stood just outside the RV window, towering over everything at nearly 9 feet tall. Its body was emaciated. Its skin stretched tight over its bones like it hadn't eaten in years. Black ichor dripped from its deer skull head and antlers, staining the snow beneath it. It didn't move right away, just stared at me with hollow eyes that seemed endless, like they could see straight into my soul. Then it spoke, not with words but with whispers that filled my mind. "I've been watching you," it said softly. He was full of despair, full of pain, worthy food. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The Wendigo was right there, staring at me through the frosted window of the RV. Its hollow eyes seemed to pull at something deep inside me, like it was trying to drag my soul out of my body. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the table, forcing myself to look away. The whispers grew louder, filling the RV like a storm. They weren't just voices anymore, they were memories. My wife laughing, my son calling out to me. Happy moments twisted into something dark and wrong. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The Wendigo tilted its head, its antlers scraping against the roof of the RV. "You called me," it said in that same soft, whispery voice. "Your grief, your pain. It woke me." I shook my head, backing away from the window. "No, I didn't call you." But deep down, I knew it was right. The weight of losing my family had been crushing me for months, and coming here, this place filled with memories, had only made it worse. My despair had drawn it out of whatever dark place it had been hiding. The Wendigo moved then, faster than anything that size should be able to move. It slammed into the side of the RV, shaking it so hard I thought it might tip over. The protective symbols Frank and I had carved into the walls glowed faintly, holding it back for now, but I could feel them weakening. I grabbed my son's urn from the table, clutching it tightly as an idea began to form in my mind. The ashes, They had glowed when the Wendigo got close. Maybe they could stop it. The RV shook again as the creature slammed into it a second time. Cracks spread across the windows and frost crept inside like icy fingers reaching for me. "Come outside," it whispered. "It sits easier if you don't sit fight." "No," I shouted back, holding the urn closer to my chest. I opened one of Frank's hunting knives and carved more symbols into the doorframe while muttering every prayer I could remember from my childhood. The whispers turned into growls, and then silence. For a moment, I thought it was gone, but then I heard footsteps on the roof. The Wendigo was above me now, its weight making the entire RV groan under the pressure. It was trying to find a way in, testing every weak spot like a predator playing with its prey. I couldn't stay here. If I did, I'd die just like Frank and the Johnsons, and who knows how many others before us. Clutching the urn tightly, I opened the door and stepped outside into the freezing night air. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked toward the lake, my breath coming out in shaky clouds. The Wendigo followed me silently, its massive form blending with the shadows of the trees. When I reached the edge of the lake, I turned to face it. "You want me?" I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Come and get me." The creature stepped out of the shadows fully now, its antlers glinting in the moonlight and its hollow eyes locked onto mine. It moved slowly at first, savoring every step like it enjoyed watching me squirm. As it got closer, I opened the urn and scattered some of my son's ashes onto the snow between us. The reaction was immediate. The Wendigo recoiled with an ear-piercing screech that made my ears ring. Black ichor dripped from its body as if it were melting where the ashes touched it. I didn't stop. I kept scattering more ashes as I backed toward the lake, luring it closer to the water's edge. "You don't belong here," I said through gritted teeth. "Go back to wherever you came from." The Wendigo lunged at me then, its claws outstretched and its mouth open wide in a silent scream. At that moment, I threw what remained of my son's ashes directly at its face. The creature howled in agony as its body began to disintegrate before my eyes. Its antlers cracked and fell away like dead branches, and its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light before fading into darkness. But not before it struck me one last time. Its claws raked across my chest as it fell into the icy water of Pinewood Lake, dragging me down with it for a moment before letting go. I clawed my way back to shore, gasping for air as snowflakes fell around me. I knew then that I wasn't going to make it. The wounds were too deep. I could feel myself slipping away, but for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt at peace. As I lay there on the frozen ground, staring up at the stars through a break in the clouds, I saw them, my wife and son, smiling down at me like they were waiting for me on the other side. And then everything went quiet. My name is Gabriela Martinez, and this is the story of how my family's vacation became something I'll never forget, something I wish I could forget. It started in the summer of 1988, when my dad decided we needed a break from our busy lives. He rented an old RV, a big boxy thing called a Fleetwood Bounder, and said we were going to drive across the country together. Just us, no distractions. At first I thought it would be fun, but I had no idea what we were walking into. We arrived at Clearwater Caverns RV Park in New Mexico late in the afternoon. The place was strange. It was quiet, too quiet for a campground. The desert stretched out around us, dry and endless, and there were only 6 or 7 other RVs parked there. Oddly enough, all of them looked almost exactly like ours, same shape, same faded paint job. My dad joked that we'd picked the Fleet Special, but something about it felt off. A man greeted us as we pulled in. He was tall and thin, with a big smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Ranger Thomas Wolf and told us where to park. He insisted we take a specific campsite near the edge of the campground, saying it had the best view. My mom, Lucia, thanked him politely, but Bandito, our German Shepherd mix, started barking like crazy as soon as he got close to us. Bandito was usually friendly with strangers, but this time he acted like he wanted to tear the guy apart. "Sorry about him," My dad said awkwardly as he tried to calm Bandito down. He Sip's not usually like this. Ranger Wolf just smiled wider and said, dogs can sense things we can't. Then he walked away without another word. That night, after we set up camp and ate dinner, things got weird. As we sat around the table inside the RV playing cards, I felt something, a faint vibration under my feet. It was so subtle that I thought I imagined it at first. Emilio, my older brother, noticed it too and asked Dad about it. It's probably just the RV settling, Dad said with a shrug, but Mom didn't seem convinced. She kept looking out the window into the darkness, like she was waiting for something to happen. Later that night, she woke up screaming from a nightmare. She said she dreamed of people screaming from beneath the earth, begging for help. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, things didn't feel right. Bandito was acting strange again. He kept sniffing around the campsite, growling at random patches of dirt like there was something buried underneath. Then, out of nowhere, he started digging. He was frantic, clawing at the ground so hard that his paws kicked up dust everywhere. Bandito, stop. Mom called out, but he wouldn't listen. Dad finally had to grab him by the collar and drag him back to the RV. What's gotten into this dog? He muttered, under his breath. Later that day, Dad and Emilio decided to explore the caves nearby. Clearwater Caverns was famous for its ancient pictographs, paintings left by indigenous people hundreds of years ago, and Emilio wanted to take pictures for his photography hobby. I wanted to go too, but Mom said I had to stay behind and help her clean up. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I didn't argue. While they were gone, I met a girl from one of the other RVs. Her name was Diana, and she seemed nice at first, about my age, with long brown hair and a soft voice. But there was something off about her. She watched me too closely, like she was studying me, and when I told her my name, she repeated it back in this weird way, like she was trying it out for the first time. Gabriella, she said slowly, almost like she was tasting the word. That Sip's a pretty name. I felt uneasy but tried to be polite. Thanks, I said. Are you here with your family? She nodded and pointed toward an RV that looked just like ours. That Sip's ours over there. I glanced at it and noticed something strange. No one ever seemed to come in or out of it. The curtains were drawn tight, and the door stayed shut all day long. Meanwhile, Mom had been watching some of the other campers too. She told me later that she noticed something odd about them. They never seemed to eat or drink anything. They just sat outside their RVs, pretending to sip from cups or poke at plates of food that didn't even look real. When Dad and Emilio came back from the caves that evening, they looked shaken up. Emilio showed us some pictures he had taken on his camera, close-ups of claw marks on the cave walls and patches of dirt that looked freshly dug up. Probably just animals, Dad said quickly, brushing it off. But Emilio wasn't so sure. These weren't normal claw marks, he insisted. They were huge. That night, as we got ready for bed, we noticed something else strange. Our RV had shifted slightly from where we'd parked it. The ground beneath it seemed uneven now, like it had been disturbed somehow. It's just the desert wind, Dad said when we pointed it out. But I could tell he didn't really believe that. By the fourth day, everything started falling apart. Emilio was the first to go missing. That morning, he told us he wanted to go back to the caves. He said there was something he hadn't photographed yet, something he'd seen in the shadows but couldn't quite capture. Mom didn't want him to go, but Dad said it was fine as long as he didn't wander too far. Emilio grabbed his camera and promised to be back by lunch. But lunch came and went, and Emilio didn't return. At first, Dad tried to stay calm. He probably lost track of time, he said, pacing around the campsite. You know how he gets when he's focused on something. But as the hours dragged on, Mom started panicking. She insisted we call the local sheriff. When the sheriff finally arrived, he didn't seem very interested in helping us. He was an older man with a tired face and a slow way of talking. Teenagers run off all the time, he said with a shrug. Mom was furious. He didn't run off. He Sep's missing. The sheriff sighed and promised to look into it, but I could tell he wasn't going to do much. That evening, I saw Diana again. She was standing outside her RV, staring at me like she'd been waiting for me to come out. This time, something about her felt even creepier than before. She was wearing Emilio's bracelet, the one with the little silver charm that Mom had given him for his birthday. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice shaking. She tilted her head and smiled in this weird, empty way. "It's mine," she said softly. "No, it's Sep's not." I snapped. "That belongs to my brother." She didn't answer me. Instead, she turned and walked back toward her RV without another word. I ran inside to tell Mom what I'd seen, but she was already distracted by something else. Our RV had sunk even deeper into the ground. The wheels were half buried now, like the earth was swallowing it up bit by bit. Dad grabbed a flashlight and started inspecting the ground around us. That's when he found it, a hollow spot near the back of our campsite where the dirt caved in slightly under his weight. He shined the light down into it and saw what looked like a tunnel. "This isn't normal," Dad muttered under his breath. Mom sat down at the table inside the RV and started flipping through a brochure she'd picked up when we first arrived at Clearwater Caverns. It mentioned that the campground had been built on land where a mining disaster occurred in the 1950s, a collapse that killed dozens of workers and left tunnels running beneath the area. "I don't like this," Mom said quietly, her voice trembling. That night she had another vision, this time of pale creatures living underground, borrowing faces from above. She woke up crying and told Dad about it, but he just held her and said everything would be fine. I wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, things got even worse. Dad and Mom were both on edge, and Bandito wouldn't stop growling at the ground near the RV. It felt like the whole campground was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's Sep's when I found Emilio Sep's camera. I was looking for something in the RV when I noticed the air vent near the floor was slightly loose. Curious, I reached inside and pulled out his camera. It was dusty and scratched, like it had been shoved in there in a hurry. My hands were shaking as I turned it on and started flipping through the pictures. Most of them were from the caves, pictures of claw marks on the walls, strange piles of dirt, and dark tunnels that seemed to go on forever. But then there were photos that didn't make any sense. One showed Ranger Wolf standing near one of the cave entrances, his eyes glowing unnaturally in the flash. Another showed Diana's face, but it wasn't right. Her features looked like they were melting, shifting into something else entirely. I showed the pictures to Mom and Dad. Mom gasped and covered her mouth, but Dad just stared at them in silence. Finally, he said, "We need to leave. Now." As we started packing up, I noticed something strange about the other RVs in the campground. There were fewer of them now. Only 3 or 4 left, but I hadn't seen anyone drive away. And the people who were still there, they weren't acting normal. They just sat outside their RVs staring at us with blank expressions. Then I saw Diana again. She was standing near one of the hollow patches of ground, watching me with that same eerie smile. I decided to follow her. Something inside me needed to know what was going on. She walked slowly toward the edge of the campground and stopped near a small mound of dirt. Then she crouched down and pressed her hand against it. The ground opened up beneath her like a trapdoor. I froze as I watched her climb down into a dark hole that sealed itself shut behind her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I ran back to tell Mom and Dad what I'd seen. Dad grabbed a shovel from the back of the RV and started digging where Diana had disappeared. It didn't take long before he hit something, a tunnel leading straight down into the earth. "We said her going in," he said firmly. Mom hesitated, but she nodded. "We have to find Emilio." I wasn't sure if it was bravery or desperation that made me follow them into that dark hole, but either way, there was no turning back now. The tunnel was cold and damp, and the air smelled like wet dirt. Dad led the way with the flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Bandito followed close behind, his ears pinned back and his tail low. Mom held my hand tightly as we moved deeper underground, her grip so firm it hurt. None of us spoke. The silence pressed down on us like a weight. The walls of the tunnel were rough, carved out unevenly, as if something had clawed its way through the earth. Every now and then, we'd pass strange markings, symbols scratched into the dirt that looked ancient and unfamiliar. Mom stopped at one of them and ran her fingers over it. "These are warnings," she whispered. "Navajo symbols. They kept her telling us to stay away." Dad didn't stop. "We're not leaving without Emilio," he said, his voice hard. As we went deeper, we started finding things, discarded belongings scattered across the ground. A backpack, a pair of shoes, a broken watch. They looked old, like they'd been down here for years. But then we found something newer, Emilio's camera bag. Mom gasped and picked it up, clutching it to her chest like it was him. Then we heard it. A faint sound coming from up ahead. It was a low humming noise, almost like a machine, but not quite. It made my skin crawl. We followed the sound until we reached a larger chamber deep underground. The flashlight revealed piles of belongings stacked against the walls, clothes, suitcases, even toys, all covered in dust. And in the center of the room were people. At least, I thought they were people at first. They were lying on the ground in rows, their bodies stiff and pale like they were asleep, or maybe frozen. Their faces looked wrong, like they'd been stretched too far or squished too small. I recognized some of them from the campground, the campers who never ate or drank anything. "They said not real," Mom whispered. "They said copies." That Seps when we saw Emilio. He was lying at the edge of the room, his body limp and his eyes closed. He looked pale but alive. At least I hoped he was alive. Mom ran to him and shook him gently. "Emilio, wake up," she cried. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, but he didn't say anything. He looked at us like he didn't know who we were. Then I saw them, the creatures. They crawled out from tunnels all around us, pale and thin with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Their faces looked human at first glance, but their movements gave them away. They twitched and jerked unnaturally as they surrounded us. "Run," Dad shouted, but there was nowhere to run. The creatures moved closer, their pale skin glowing faintly in the flashlight beam, their limbs twisted and stretched as they crawled toward us, their faces flickering between human-like features and something monstrous. Bandito barked furiously, standing between us and them, but his growls didn't scare them. They didn't even flinch. Dad grabbed a piece of broken metal from the pile of belongings and swung it at one of the creatures. It screeched, a high-pitched sound that made my ears ring, but it didn't stop. More of them poured into the chamber, crawling out of the tunnels like spiders. "We have to get Emilio out of here," Mom shouted. Dad nodded and tried to lift Emilio, but he was too weak to stand on his own. I grabbed Emilio's arm and helped Dad drag him toward the tunnel we came from. Bandito stayed behind, barking and snapping at the creatures to keep them distracted. "Bandito, come on," I screamed, but he didn't move. The creatures were faster than we thought. One of them lunged at Dad, knocking him to the ground. Another grabbed Mom's arm with long, claw-like fingers that left deep scratches in her skin. I froze, too scared to move, as one of them turned its hollow eyes toward me. "Gabriela, run," Dad yelled. I wanted to help them, but I couldn't. My legs moved on their own as I dragged Emilio toward the tunnel entrance. Tears blurred my vision as I heard Mom scream behind me, her voice cut off suddenly, replaced by that awful screeching sound. I didn't look back. The tunnel seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in front of me. Emilio's weight slowed me down, but I refused to let go of him. Behind us, I could hear the creatures crawling closer, their claws scraping against the dirt walls. Then I remembered something Mom had said about sound. I dropped Emilio for a moment and pulled the flashlight from Dad's bag. It wasn't much, but it had a small alarm built into it. A loud beeping noise meant for emergencies. I pressed the button as hard as I could, and the sound echoed through the tunnel like a siren. The creatures screeched again, louder this time, and stopped moving for a moment. It wasn't much, but it gave me enough time to drag Emilio out of the tunnel and back into the open air. I stumbled toward our RV, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The ground beneath it was cracked and uneven now, sinking deeper into the earth with each passing second. I shoved Emilio inside and slammed the door shut behind us. The creatures were coming, climbing out of the tunnel and crawling across the campground toward us. Their faces flickered in the moonlight, shifting between human features and something too horrible to describe. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The RV roared to life just as one of the creatures reached for the door. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and we lurched forward, tearing out of the campsite as fast as I could drive. Behind us, I heard a deep rumbling sound, the earth collapsing in on itself. The campground disappeared into a massive sinkhole, swallowing everything. The RVs, the tunnels, even Ranger Wolf's cabin. I thought we were safe until I glanced at Emilio in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, barely a second, his face shifted. His eyes turned black, his skin pale like theirs. Then he blinked, and he looked normal again. I didn't say anything. Hours later, we stopped at a gas station far from Clearwater Caverns. Emilio was asleep in the back seat while I called the authorities from a payphone outside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. As I hung up, a trucker walked up to me and smiled kindly. "You okay there?" he asked. I nodded weakly. "You look just like your brother," he said casually. I froze. "What did you say?" He tilted his head slightly but didn't answer right away, and then his smile stretched too wide for his face. "My name is Dr. Howard Palmer. I'm 38 years old, a psychiatrist by profession. Well, let's just say my life hasn't exactly been smooth sailing lately. A messy divorce, a career that feels like it's slipping through my fingers, and this gnawing need to prove myself, it's what brought me here to this strange little town called Misty Harbor. I rolled into town in my silver 1965 Airstream land yacht. It's more than just an RV to me. It's home, or at least the closest thing I've got to one these days. The campground I picked to stay at is called Shipwreck Point. The name alone should have been a warning, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It's perched right on the edge of these steep cliffs overlooking the ocean. Beautiful, sure, but there's something eerie about it too. The air smells salty and damp, and there's this constant mist hanging around, like the place is hiding something. The campground caretaker, old Jim Wilson, was the first person I met. He was this wiry old guy with a face like crumpled leather and eyes that seemed to know more than they let on. When I parked my RV near the cliffs, he shuffled over and said, "You don't want to park too close there, Doc. The fog out here's got a way of swallowing things up." I laughed it off, thought he was just being dramatic, but the way he looked at me made my stomach twist a little. I wasn't here for sightseeing or ghost stories, though. My goal was clear: investigate what the locals were calling forgetting sickness. People in Misty Harbor had been losing chunks of their memories. Hours, days, sometimes even years, and no one could explain why. It wasn't just old folks either. Young people were affected too. I'd read about 17 cases in the past year alone. My first stop was the town clinic to meet Dr. Martha Prescott. She was sharp and no nonsense, probably in her mid-50s, with a stern demeanor that softened when she talked about her patients. "It's not Alzheimer's or dementia," she told me firmly as we sat in her tiny office. "It's something else entirely. They lose time, whole stretches of it, and when they come back to themselves, they're different." "Different how?" I asked. "Detached," she said after a pause. "Like pieces of them are missing." That night, as I settled into my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The fog outside had thickened unnaturally fast, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. I tried to brush it off as nerves or exhaustion from the long drive. But then came the sounds. At first, it was faint whispers, so soft I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, they grew louder and clearer. Words I couldn't quite make out floated through the air like they were coming from inside the fog itself. And then there was scratching, a slow, deliberate sound against the metal walls of my RV. I grabbed a flashlight and swung open the door, shining it into the misty darkness outside. Nothing. Just swirling fog and silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just my imagination acting up after hearing old Jim's warnings and Dr. Prescott's stories. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right about this place. And that was just my first night in Misty Harbor. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. My head was buzzing with questions about what I'd heard the night before. Was it just my imagination, or was there something more to this fog? I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were hiding somewhere in Misty Harbor. I spent the day digging into the town's history. The library was small and smelled like old paper, but it had records going back centuries. What I found made my skin crawl. Misty Harbor had a long history of disappearances, people vanishing without a trace during periods of heavy fog. It wasn't just a few cases either. It was dozens, maybe even hundreds, stretching all the way back to colonial times. One name kept popping up in my research. Dr. Edwin Hargrove. He was a doctor who lived here in the 1930s and had investigated similar phenomena. His notes were scattered across old medical journals and town records, but they painted a chilling picture. He described people losing their memories, hearing voices in the fog, and seeing strange shapes moving through it. His final entry was cryptic. The fog is alive, it watches, it waits. After that, there were no more records of him. I couldn't stop thinking about those words as I walked along the rocky shoreline later that afternoon. The cliffs were steep and jagged, and the ocean below churned like it was angry about something. That's when I noticed them, symbols carved into the rocks near the shore. They were rough and weathered, but clearly deliberate, spirals, lines, shapes that looked almost like eyes. I took pictures and showed them to Eliza Foster later that evening. Eliza was one of the few people in town who had recovered from the forgetting sickness. She was reluctant to talk about her experience at first, but when she saw the symbols, her face went pale. "They said for protection markers," she said quietly. "People used to carve them to keep things away." "What things?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as if she expected something to be watching us from outside. "The fog isn't just mist," she said finally. "There sips something in it, something that takes people's sips memories and feeds on them." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but she shut down after that, refusing to say another word. That night, I decided to set up my tape recorder outside the RV while I slept. If there was something strange happening in this fog, I wanted proof. When I played back the recording the next morning, my heart nearly stopped. At first, it was just normal sounds. The wind rustling through trees, waves crashing against rocks, but then came voices. Clear as day. Voices whispered things like, "He's here, and the doctor is next." My hands shook as I rewound the tape over and over again, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Later that day, while walking through town, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A fisherman standing at the edge of the cliffs, staring blankly into the fog. He didn't move for hours. He just stood there like he was waiting for something. When he finally turned around and walked back into town, his face looked empty, like whatever made him him wasn't there anymore. I tried talking to him, but he didn't seem to understand me, or even recognize where he was. That night, as I sat alone in my RV listening to the tape recorder again, I realized something terrifying. Whatever was out there in the fog, it knew me now. By the time the third night rolled around, I was starting to feel the weight of this place. Misty Harbor wasn't just eerie, it was suffocating. The fog seemed thicker than usual, curling around my RV like it was alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. That evening, I noticed something strange. My research notes, the ones I'd been carefully organizing, were out of order. Pages were missing, and some had scribbles on them that I didn't remember writing. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired or distracted, but then I saw it, a note written in handwriting that wasn't mine. It said, "We remember you." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who or what had written that? Determined to figure out what was going on, I set up a Polaroid camera in the RV with a timer to take pictures while I slept. If something or someone was messing with me, I wanted proof. The next morning, I flipped through the photos one by one. Most of them showed me sleeping. The RV bathed in dim light, but then I got to one that made my stomach drop. In the picture, tendrils of fog were snaking through the cracks of the RV door, glowing faintly as they reached toward me. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the light? A reflection? But deep down, I knew better. Later that day, as I walked through town, I noticed something else. My ex-wife's photo in my wallet had changed. Her face was blurred now, her features replaced by two glowing points where her eyes should have been. My hand started shaking so badly that I dropped the wallet. I didn't have time to dwell on it because something even worse happened that evening. The fog rolled in thicker than ever before, so dense it felt like walking through soup. As I stood near the cliffs trying to clear my head, I saw a camper from Shipwreck Point walking straight into the fog. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he was being pulled by an invisible force. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking toward the edge of the cliffs. Panic surged through me as I ran after him. "Stop," I shouted, grabbing his arm just before he reached the edge. But as soon as I touched him, something hit me. A wave of memories, so vivid and painful that it knocked me to my knees. It wasn't just my memories. It was everything from my failed marriage, every fight, every regret, every moment of guilt and loss crashing into me, all at once. It felt like drowning in emotions I thought I'd buried long ago. When I looked up again, the camper was gone, swallowed by the fog. We searched for him for hours after that. Me and a few locals, but we found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing but endless mist stretching out over the cliffs. That night in my RV, as I stared at the Polaroid photo again and listened to my tape recorder, whispering cryptic messages like "the doctor is next," one thing became painfully clear. Whatever was out there in the fog wasn't just watching me, it was coming for me. By the seventh day, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My notes kept changing, my memories felt slippery, and I was starting to lose chunks of time. One moment, I'd be writing down observations, and the next, I'd find myself standing outside my RV with no idea how I got there. I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. Desperate for answers, I set up more equipment around the RV, microphones, cameras, anything that might help me understand what was happening. I even rigged up a few makeshift electrical defenses using an old car battery and some wires. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had some control. That night, as the fog rolled in again, I sat inside the RV staring at the map I'd been working on. Over the past week, I'd been tracking the movement of the fog, where it came from, how it spread, and something about it didn't make sense. It wasn't random. The patterns were too deliberate, almost like the fog was alive. As I studied the map, a sound outside made me freeze. It was faint at first, a low hum like electricity buzzing through power lines, but it grew louder and louder until it felt like it was right outside my door. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. The fog wasn't just swirling aimlessly anymore. It was moving with purpose, coiling and twisting like it had a mind of its own. And then, it started to take shape. At first, it was just a vague outline, a tall humanoid figure with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the mist. But as I watched, more details emerged. Long, tentacle-like appendages reaching out toward me, shifting and writhing like they were alive. I stumbled back into the RV and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely lock it. The hum grew louder, and then came the whispers, dozens of voices all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "We remember you. You cannot hide. Give us what we want." I pressed my hands over my ears to block out the noise, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just outside, they were inside my head now. And then, they showed me flashes of memories that weren't mine, people being pulled into the fog, their faces twisted in terror as glowing tendrils wrapped around them. Their screams echoed in my mind as their memories were ripped away piece by piece until there was nothing left but empty shells. I realized then what these things were. Ancient beings that fed on human consciousness and memories. They didn't just take your thoughts. They took you, everything that made you who you were, gone. That Seps, when Eliza Seps' words came back to me, I survived by giving them what they wanted. But what did they want from me? As if in answer to my question, one of the tentacles smashed against the RV window with a loud thud. The glass cracked but didn't break. My makeshift electrical defenses must have been working, but I knew they wouldn't hold for long. I had to do something, anything. Grabbing a notebook and pen, I started writing down everything I could remember about myself. My name, my childhood, my marriage, anything that felt important. If they were going to take my memories, at least I'd have something left behind to prove I existed. The whispers grew louder as more tendrils pressed against the RV walls. The metal groaned under the pressure, and rust began spreading across its surface like wildfire. My defenses were failing, and then everything went silent. For a moment, I thought maybe they sit given up, but then a voice, clearer than all the others, spoke directly into my mind. Choose. The voice in my head was calm, almost soothing, but its words carried a weight that crushed me. Choose, it repeated. I didn't need to ask what it meant. I already knew. They wanted my memories. Specifically, they wanted the memories of my ex-wife, of our marriage, of everything we'd been through together. The good, the bad, all of it. They wanted me to give up the part of myself that still held on to her. I sat there frozen, staring at the notebook where I'd written down bits and pieces of my life. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, reading about moments that felt like they belonged to someone else now. The first time we met, our wedding day. The fights that tore us apart. The way she smiled when she was happy. If I gave those memories up, would I survive? Eliza had done it. She'd sacrificed something to escape these things. But if I let them take those pieces of me, would I still be me? The fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the RV like it was trying to squeeze the life out of it. The tendrils were everywhere now, glowing faintly as they wrapped around the windows and doors. The voices whispered softly, almost like a lullaby. Let go. It will be easier. You cannot fight us. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to block them out, but their words seeped into my mind like poison. Memories of my ex-wife flashed before me. Her laughter, her tears, the way she looked at me when she said goodbye during our divorce. It was overwhelming, like they were pulling those moments to the surface so they could take them. And then I realized something. They weren't just asking for my memories. They were offering me a choice between survival and complete destruction. If I gave them what they wanted, I might live, but if I refused, they would consume me entirely. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let them take her away from me. Not again. With shaking hands, I grabbed my RV keys and started the engine. The roar of the motor cut through the whispers for a moment, giving me a small window of clarity. I knew what I had to do. The fog tightened around the RV as I slammed it into drive and pressed down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the wet ground as I sped toward the cliffs, aiming straight for the edge where the ocean waited below. The voices screamed in protest as the tendrils lashed out violently, cracking windows and tearing at the metal walls. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. As the RV hurtled over the edge, time seemed to slow down. The fog peeled away for a brief moment, revealing glowing eyes staring at me from every direction. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Their anger was palpable, but so was their fear. And then, impact. The RV plunged into the icy water below, sinking fast as waves crashed over it. For a moment, everything went quiet. The whispers stopped, and the tendrils dissolved into nothingness. I felt myself slipping away as cold water filled the RV and darkness closed in around me. But before everything went black, one thought lingered in my mind. I hadn't let them win. When the authorities found the wreckage of my RV washed up on the rocky shore 2 days later, they didn't know what to make of it. The metal was corroded, rusted beyond anything they'd seen before, like it had been sitting underwater for decades instead of hours. My body was recovered, but the strangest thing was the notebook they found clutched in my hand. The pages were soaked and smeared, but some of the writing was still legible. Warnings about the fog, descriptions of glowing tendrils, and voices whispering in the night. I'd written down everything I could remember before it all fell apart. At least now, someone might know what happened here. Eliza Foster was the one who identified my body. She stood on the shore as they pulled me out of the water, her face pale and her hands trembling. But when they asked her if she knew me, she hesitated. "I think I met him once," she said quietly, her voice unsure, "but I don't stir remember much." It didn't make sense. She talked to me about the fog, about surviving it, but now it was like those memories had been erased or maybe taken. The campground at Shipwreck Point was shut down after my death. The locals said it was cursed, that too many strange things had happened there over the years. Old Jim Wilson packed up and left town without a word, and Dr. Martha Prescott stopped taking cases related to memory loss altogether. But Misty Harbor didn't change. The fog still rolled in every evening, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around the cliffs like a shroud. People still whispered about disappearances and strange happenings near the shore. And then came the new researcher. A young man arrived in town a few weeks later, carrying a backpack full of equipment and a notebook filled with questions about me, about Dr. Howard Palmer, and what happened to him. He set up camp at Shipwreck Point despite the warnings from locals and started asking questions about the forgetting sickness. On his first night there, as he sat alone in his tent staring out at the ocean, he heard something, whispers floating through the fog like distant echoes. And then he heard my voice. "Leave while you still can." The fog curled closer around his tent as he froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew better. Some memories never truly fade away. My name is Jennifer Thompson. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I've spent most of my adult life studying canids, wolves, coyotes, foxes, you name it. I love being out in the wild, surrounded by nature, but I never thought my honeymoon would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It started when my husband, Robert, and I decided to spend 3 weeks camping in Whispering Pines National Forest in northern Michigan. Robert is a romantic literature professor. He's dreamy and idealistic, the complete opposite of me. We just got married, and he thought a secluded honeymoon in the woods would be perfect for us. I agreed because, honestly, I love the forest. But Whispering Pines, it's not like other places. It's old. It feels alive in a way that's hard to explain. We arrived in our vintage 1978 GMC motorhome late one afternoon. The air smelled fresh, but there was something off about it, something heavy that I couldn't shake. We picked a camping spot far off the main trail, even though the park ranger, Donna Lewis, warned us not to stray too far from the marked areas. She said people had gone missing here before. Wildlife attacks, she claimed, but Robert brushed it off as urban legends meant to scare tourists. The first night was quiet at first. We set up camp, cooked dinner over the fire, and talked about how amazing it was to be away from everything. But as the sun went down and darkness settled over the forest, things started to feel wrong. The howling began around midnight, not normal wolf howls, but something deeper and more guttural. It echoed through the trees like it was coming from everywhere at once. I tried to convince myself it was just wolves, but when I looked out into the forest, I felt like someone or something was watching us. The shadows between the trees seemed to move on their own. Robert didn't notice. He was too busy reading one of his poetry books by lantern light. The next morning, as we were walking around our campsite, I noticed strange tracks in the dirt. They were huge, bigger than any wolf tracks I'd ever seen, and they had an odd shape to them, almost human-like, but not quite right. When I pointed them out to Robert, he laughed and said maybe Bigfoot was real after all. Later that day, we found something even stranger, a primitive stone arrangement near our campsite that looked like some kind of shrine. It didn't seem natural. It had been placed there deliberately, but there were no signs of who might have made it or why. Robert thought it was fascinating and started taking pictures while quoting lines from old poems about nature and mystery. That night was worse than the first. The howling came back louder and closer this time. The air felt heavy again, like it was pressing down on me. As I lay in bed inside the motorhome, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or squirrels rustling in the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. Robert didn't seem to notice. He was in a great mood, making coffee and talking about how peaceful it was out here. I didn't want to ruin it for him, so I kept my thoughts to myself. As we packed up for a hike, I couldn't stop thinking about the tracks we'd seen the day before. Something about them didn't sit right with me. I've studied animals my whole life, and I've never seen anything like that. But Robert was so excited to explore, and I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I let it go. We decided to follow a small trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches weaving together like a ceiling above us. The sunlight barely made it through, and everything felt closed in. As we walked, I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" I asked Robert at one point. "See what?" he replied, looking around. I thought, "Never mind," I said, shaking my head. Maybe I was imagining things. A few hours into our hike, we stumbled across something incredible. A rock face covered in ancient carvings. The images were worn but still visible. Bipedal creatures with wolf-like features standing among humans. It sent a shiver down my spine. "This is amazing," Robert said, running his fingers over the carvings. "It seeps like something out of mythology." I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the way the creatures were depicted, like they were watching us through time. Later that afternoon, we met a local historian named Margaret Wilson at a small visitor center near the edge of the park. When we mentioned the carvings, her expression changed. She told us about an old legend, the Walkaway people. According to her, they were a tribe that had lived in these forests long ago but had chosen to leave their human forms behind and become something else. Something wild. Robert loved the story. He thought it was poetic. But to me, it felt like more than just a legend. That evening, back at our campsite, Robert decided to go for a solo hike while I stayed behind to organize our supplies. He promised he'd be back before dark, but as the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, I started to worry. When he finally returned, something about him seemed different. He smiled at me as if nothing had happened, but his eyes looked sharper somehow, like they were reflecting more light than they should have been in the dim glow of our lantern. He didn't say much about where he'd been or what he'd seen, which wasn't like him at all. Normally, Robert loved to talk about everything he experienced. That night, as we sat by the fire, I noticed little things. He kept sniffing the air like he could smell something I couldn't. And when we cooked dinner, he insisted on eating his steak almost raw, which was strange because he usually liked it well done. I tried to brush it off as him just being tired from his hike, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As we settled into bed inside the motorhome that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us from the trees might have found its way closer. The next morning, I woke up to find Robert standing outside the motorhome, staring into the forest. He wasn't moving, just standing there completely still like he was waiting for something. The air felt colder than usual, and the trees seemed darker even though the sun was shining. "Robert?" I called out, stepping outside. "What are you doing?" He turned to look at me, his face calm but distant. "Just listening," he said. "Listening to what?" I asked. "The forest," he replied, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know what to say. Something about his tone made my stomach twist. He wasn't acting like himself, and I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding crazy. As the day went on, things kept getting stranger. The vegetation around our campsite seemed to be growing faster than normal, vines creeping closer to the motorhome, leaves bigger and greener than they should have been for this time of year. It was subtle at first, but by afternoon it was impossible to ignore. "Doesn't this seem weird to you?" I asked Robert as we sat outside trying to enjoy lunch. He shrugged. "It's just nature doing its thing." I wanted to argue, but he seemed so calm about it that I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I decided to take a walk around the campsite while Robert stayed behind to read. That's when I found it, a small leather journal tucked under some rocks near the edge of our site. The pages were worn and water-stained, but I could still make out most of the writing. It belonged to someone who had camped here before, a man named Daniel, and his entries were chilling. He described hearing strange noises at night, seeing figures in the trees, and feeling like he was being watched. The last few pages talked about how his body had started changing, how he couldn't control his thoughts anymore, and then nothing. The journal ended abruptly. I rushed back to the motorhome and showed it to Robert, but he barely glanced at it before dismissing it as someone's attempt at a horror story. "You don't really believe this, do you?" he asked with a smirk. "I don't, Verishino," I admitted. "But doesn't it sound familiar? The noises, the tracks, the way you've been acting?" He laughed and shook his head. "You start overthinking things." But I wasn't set so sure. That night was the worst yet. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Robert gone from bed. Panicking, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside into the cold darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, but there was no wind. Then I heard it howling, deep and guttural, just like before, but this time it was close. Too close. I followed the sound until I found Robert standing in a clearing under the moonlight. He wasn't alone. There were figures in the shadows, tall and humanoid, but not human. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark as they watched him. "Robert," I called out, my voice shaking. He turned slowly to look at me, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. His ears looked slightly pointed, his teeth sharper than they should have been. His face was still his, but not quite. "Go back," he said softly. His voice almost a growl. It set safer inside. I didn't argue. I ran back to the motorhome as fast as I could and locked the door behind me. The next morning, Robert acted like nothing had happened, but when I looked closely at him, I saw more changes. His hair seemed thicker, his movements smoother and faster than before. And when another camper wandered too close to our site later that day, Robert stood protectively between me and them like an animal guarding its territory. I knew then that whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. By the 5th day, I could barely recognize the man I married. Robert's behavior had become more erratic, and his physical changes were undeniable. His ears were sharper, his teeth seemed longer, and his eyes glinted in the light like an animal's. But it wasn't just his appearance, it was the way he moved, the way he looked at me like he was both himself and something else. The forest around us seemed to be closing in. The plants had grown so much that they were wrapping around the motorhome almost like they were alive. Vines twisted up the sides and thick roots had started to push through the ground beneath us. It felt like we were being trapped. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, watching Robert as he sat by the fire outside. He didn't seem tired at all. If anything, he looked more awake than I'd ever seen him. Around midnight, he got up and started walking toward the trees. "Robert?" I called out, but he didn't answer. I grabbed a flashlight and followed him at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. He moved quickly and silently through the forest, like he knew exactly where he was going. I struggled to keep up without making noise. After what felt like forever, we came to a clearing. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what was there. A group of figures stood in a circle around a massive tree that seemed ancient. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, its branches reaching high into the sky. The figures were tall and wolf-like, standing on two legs but with features that were unmistakably animalistic. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Robert stepped into the circle like he belonged there. One of the creatures, a larger one with silver streaks in its fur, approached him and placed a clawed hand on his shoulder. They didn't speak out loud, but it was clear they were communicating somehow. Robert nodded slowly, his face calm and almost peaceful. I stayed hidden behind a tree, too terrified to move. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't just animals, they were something else entirely. Something intelligent. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Another person, a camper from one of the nearby sites, was dragged into the clearing by two of the creatures. He was screaming and struggling, but it didn't matter. The creatures surrounded him, their movements swift and precise. Within moments, it was over. I turned away, covering my mouth to keep from crying out. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. When I dared to look back, Robert was standing at the center of the circle with the larger creature, the elder dogman, beside him. They began some kind of ritual, chanting low sounds that seemed to vibrate through the air. The elder placed its hand on Robert's chest, and his body convulsed as if something inside him was waking up. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned and ran back to the motorhome as fast as I could, not caring about the noise I made this time. When Robert returned hours later, he didn't say a word about where he'd been or what had happened, but his transformation had progressed even further. His hands looked clawed now, and his voice had taken on a rougher edge. I knew then that whatever these creatures were doing to him, it wasn't going to stop. By the 6th day, I was desperate. The forest felt like it was alive, closing in on us more and more with every passing hour. The plants around the motorhome had grown into a thick barrier, making it impossible to drive out. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Robert's transformation had become impossible to ignore. His ears were fully pointed now, his teeth sharp like fangs, and his movements were so quick and smooth that they didn't seem human anymore. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and watch him disappear into whatever he was becoming. But every time I tried to talk to him about it, he brushed me off or changed the subject. It was like he didn't care, or worse, like he didn't even realize what was happening to him. That afternoon, while Robert was outside pacing near the fire, I decided to investigate the stone shrine we'd found earlier in the week. Something about it had stuck with me, like it was connected to everything that was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, trying to move quickly but quietly. When I reached the shrine, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small opening in the ground beneath the stones. It looked like an entrance to some kind of underground chamber. My heart raced as I crouched down and shined my flashlight into the darkness. The space below was cramped, but just big enough for me to crawl through. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and climbed inside. The chamber was cold and damp, with walls made of rough stone. It smelled like earth and decay, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. As I moved deeper into the space, my flashlight revealed something incredible and horrifying. The walls were covered in carvings similar to the ones we'd seen on the rock face earlier in the week. They depicted the dogmen, these bipedal wolf-like creatures, but this time there were more details. The carvings showed humans being transformed into dogmen through some kind of ritual. There were symbols of moons, plants, and strange markings that looked almost like DNA strands. In one corner of the chamber, I found a pile of old leather-bound books and scrolls. They were written in a mix of languages. Some I recognized, others I didn't. But one thing was clear: these records were ancient. They described how the dogmen had existed for thousands of years, hidden from human society by their ability to control plant life and communicate telepathically. One passage caught my attention. It explained that the dogmen reproduced by converting humans during specific lunar cycles, but recently they'd been facing a problem: their offspring were being born stillborn or deformed. They needed humans with certain genetic traits to fix whatever was wrong with their species. My stomach turned as I realized why they had chosen Robert and why they hadn't harmed me yet. I grabbed one of the books and started crawling back toward the surface. But before I could reach the opening, I heard footsteps above me, heavy and deliberate. My heart pounded as I froze in place, holding my breath. Then a face appeared at the entrance. A face that wasn't human, but wasn't fully animal either. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine as it reached down and grabbed me with clawed hands. I screamed and struggled as they dragged me out of the chamber and into the forest. There were more of them waiting, at least 5 or 6, and they surrounded me quickly, blocking any chance of escape. The elder dogman stepped forward from among them, towering over me with an air of authority. Its voice wasn't audible. It spoke directly into my mind through telepathy. "You are important," it said calmly but firmly. "You will help us." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I knew it wasn't good. They led me deeper into the forest until we reached another clearing, a different one from before. This one had a large stone altar at its center, surrounded by glowing plants that seemed almost alive. Robert was there too, standing beside the altar like he belonged there now. He looked at me with eyes that were no longer fully human, but still held some trace of recognition. "Jennifer," he said softly. It's okay. But it wasn't said okay, not even close. I stood frozen in the clearing, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Robert was standing by the altar, his posture relaxed, like he was one of them now. But when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes, something human. It gave me hope, even if it was just a flicker. The elder dogman stepped closer to me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine, its voice echoed in my mind again, calm and steady. You will help us, it said. Your knowledge can save us. I didn't respond. My throat felt dry and my legs were shaking. I didn't know what they meant by help, but I wasn't about to cooperate, not after everything I'd seen. They led me to a small wooden structure on the edge of the clearing, a crude cage made of branches and vines, and locked me inside. The elder explained that they needed me to study their genetic problem and find a way to fix it. They believed my expertise in biology could help them produce healthy offspring again. I pretended to listen, nodding slowly as I tried to think of a way out, but deep down I knew I couldn't do what they wanted. Not if it meant staying here and becoming one of them. Over the next few days I watched as Robert's transformation continued. He spent more time with the colony, participating in their rituals and hunting with them at night. But every once in a while he'd come to visit me in the cage, sitting silently nearby like he was trying to remember who he was. Robert, I whispered one night when we were alone. You don't instead have to do this. He looked at me, his expression conflicted. Ching, it's too late, he said quietly. I can feel it changing me. It's not too late, I insisted. You are still you. I know you are. He didn't respond, but I could see the struggle in his eyes. While I was trapped in the cage, I started paying attention to everything around me, the creatures' movements, their rituals, their weaknesses. I noticed that their ability to control plants seemed tied to the clearing itself. Whenever they left its boundaries, their powers weakened. And during the new moon, they seemed less confident, like something about the lack of lunar energy affected them. I also remembered something I'd read in the journal from the camper who had disappeared. Silver and mountain ash extract could temporarily reverse the transformation. It wasn't much, but it was something. One night, during a moment of lucidity, Robert slipped me a small knife he'd hidden from the colony. It wasn't much, but it gave me hope that he hadn't completely lost himself. I will help you escape, he whispered. But you have to promise you won't to come back for me. I didn't answer right away because I couldn't make that promise, not yet. The next night, as the colony prepared for another ritual under the full moon, Robert came to my cage again. This time, he looked more human than he had in days. His movements slower, his expression softer. I can distract them, he said quietly. But you have to run. Robert, I started to protest. There's no time, he interrupted. They will notice soon. I nodded reluctantly and gripped the knife tightly as he unlocked the cage with trembling hands. Thank you, I whispered. He didn't respond, just nodded before turning away. As soon as he left, I ran into the forest as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The plants seemed alive around me, reaching out like they were trying to grab me, but without the colony's full focus on controlling them, they weren't strong enough to stop me completely. Behind me, I heard howls, deep and guttural, and knew they were coming after me. I ran through the forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand, casting strange shadows on the trees. The howls behind me grew louder, closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If they caught me, I knew what would happen. I'd become one of them, just like Robert. The plants seemed to come alive as I ran, twisting and reaching for me like they had minds of their own. Vines snagged my ankles, branches clawed at my arms, but I fought through them, using the knife Robert had given me to hack away at anything that tried to hold me back. Finally, I saw it, the motorhome. It was still surrounded by vines and roots, but it was my only chance. I sprinted toward it, adrenaline pushing me forward even as the howls grew deafening. I reached the door and threw it open, scrambling inside and locking it behind me. The motorhome felt like a fragile sanctuary, a thin wall between me and the creatures outside. I could hear them circling, their growls vibrating through the air. I searched frantically for anything I could use as a weapon or a distraction. My eyes landed on the propane tank we'd used for cooking. An idea sparked in my mind, a desperate plan that might be my only way out. I grabbed the tank and started rigging it to explode using the supplies we had inside: matches, duct tape, anything I could find. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped everything, but I forced myself to focus. The creatures were pounding on the sides of the motorhome now, their claws scraping against the metal. And then, silence. I froze, listening. The pounding had stopped, the growls were gone. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd given up, but then I heard something worse. A voice. It wasn't audible, it was inside my head, calm and steady like before. "You cannot escape," it said. "You belong to us." I clenched my teeth and ignored it, focusing on the propane tank. When it was ready, I opened the door just enough to throw it outside and then slammed it shut again. My heart raced as I lit a match and held it near the opening. The creatures were there, dozens of them now standing just outside in the moonlight. Their glowing eyes watched me with an eerie calmness, like they knew something I didn't. And then, Robert stepped forward. He looked almost fully transformed now, his body covered in fur, his hands clawed, but his eyes still held that flicker of humanity. "Jennifer," he said softly, "don't do this." "I have to," I whispered through tears. "I'm sorry." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with pain but also understanding. "Run," he said quietly. Before I could respond, he turned and lunged at the elder dogman with a ferocity that shocked even the other creatures. The colony erupted into chaos as Robert fought against them with everything he had. Taking my chance, I lit the match and threw it outside toward the propane tank. The explosion was deafening. Fire erupted in all directions, consuming the clearing and sending shockwaves through the forest. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran as fast as I could into the darkness, tears streaming down my face as Robert's sacrifice echoed in my mind. Hours later, I stumbled out of the forest onto a deserted road. My clothes were torn, my body bruised and bloodied, but I was alive. 3 months have passed since that night. I've been researching dogmen sightings in other forests across the country, trying to understand what they are and how to stop them. But every time I look in the mirror now, I see changes. My hair is thicker than it used to be. My sense of smell is sharper. Sometimes at night, I dream about running through the forest under a full moon. And when I wake up, I can still hear howling in my mind. This isn't set over.